Welcome to the Time Talks podcast. This is episode 9. I'm Chris Time Steele, and I'm excited to share this conversation with Lewis Gordon with you all. Lewis Gordon, who is from the Bronx, is one of the most important living philosophers, and he's also a musician. He's a professor at UConn in affiliation with Jewish Studies, Caribbean and Latin American Studies, Asian and Asian American Studies, and International Studies. He's taught in South Africa and Portugal. He's also the drummer for the band ThreeGenerations. He's the world's most known scholar on Frantz Fanon. He's the author of countless books including Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism, Her Majesty's Other Children, Existentia Africana, Disciplinary Decadence, An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, Of Divine Warning with Jane Anna Gordon, What Fanon Said, A Philosophical Introduction to His Life and Thought, and many more. To give a small background on Frantz Fanon, who we discussed, he was born in 1925 in Martinique. He fought in World War II. He was injured and received Croix de Guerre medals. He abhorred Nazis but was disgusted with fighting with the French as well. He saw the racism against him and how black women in the military were forced to sleep in the captain's quarters. As pointed out by Sonia Dayan Hersbrunn, Fanon had similarities with Che Guevara. Both were doctors, and the CIA took part in both of their deaths. Fanon was a psychiatrist, author of the well-known books Black Skin, White Masks, and The Wretched of the Earth, or also known as The Damned of the Earth, that he wrote in 10 weeks before his untimely death of leukemia at the age of 38. As pointed out in Gordon's latest book, What Fanon Said, as a psychiatrist, Fanon sought to, quote, reach to the patient's humanity instead of the material nexus of effects or symptoms, unquote. Treating both the tortured and the torturers, Fanon went on to fight with the FLN in the Algerian War. His writings and philosophy have went on to inspire people all around the world. His thought was critical to the Black Panther Party, decolonial theory, political science, and much more. In Lewis Gordon's work, An Introduction to Africana Philosophy, he discusses that the term philosophy actually finds its origins in Africa as a term borrowed from Phoenician and Hittite words from ancient Kemet or Egypt. Gordon points out that philosophy is older than Europe, and the strong focus on Eurocentric philosophy misrepresents the history of thought. Gordon points out China had philosophy well before Greece, with the I Ching going back to 2852 BCE. He explains African philosophy was around 2,000 years before the first Athenian thought. Philosophies of power were coming from Kemet. There were Abyssinian discussions of coercion theory, and Nefertiti contributed to monotheism. Dr. Gordon has written about what he calls 4 kinds of invisibility, involving number 1, quantity, involving racial invisibility, number 2, time linked to land, involving indigenous invisibility, number 3, voice, involving women's voices, and number 4, knowledge, how all these things come together. In this episode, we talked about Antef and Kemetic Philosophy, colonialism, white supremacy in European philosophy used as justification, Eurocentrism, resistance, love, Fanon, and anarchism. And as always, thanks to Awareness for the music. First thing, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm doing really good. The first question is, I wanted to start off by discussing representations of resistance in the classroom, with not having students see the first image of a person of color as someone enslaved, but learning about ancient Kemet or Shanti first. Can you speak about your teaching philosophy and how this relates to the work you do?
Well, my teaching philosophy is for students to have a form of critical, reflective stand from the very beginning, okay? Mm-hmm. And what I generally do, but what I try to do is not to tell students to have that or to do it in any imposing way, but instead to have materials available that they have not seen before or heard of before, and just simply discuss them, and they develop that critical insight. So I'll give you an example. In all of my syllabi, when I'm dealing with philosophy, as an example, I put in the syllabus, right in the syllabus, a paragraph from Antef. And Antef basically was a philosopher who wrote 4,000 years ago in Kemet. And for the listeners, they may not be quite familiar, but Kemet just means darklands. It's from the language Meduneter. And that was the actual language spoken by the people today we call ancient Egyptians. Egypt wasn't their historic name. Basically, that was a transformation of the country during the period of its domination by Greek-speaking peoples much later, much more recent, in other words. And Memphis, given the temple there, the Macedonians and the subsequent Greek-speaking groups began to make that their centered city, and they called it Egypt. Okay, well, Aegyptus, but Egypt. And as is a tendency with colonization, wherever colonizers emerge, the city that they focus on, they tend to rename the entire area. So when the Romans, for instance, were in what is today Gaza, they called it, the ancient name was Philistia, and the Roman name for Philistia was Palestine. And so when the Romans basically took over the area, they named the entire area Palestine. And so a similar thing happened in terms of this vast, vast country that today we call Egypt. It's hard for many people to imagine this, but this is a huge area with a northern flowing river we know as the Nile. And because the Nile flows north, just for the listeners to know, Lower Egypt was where the Nile opened, which would be the northern Mediterranean. Upper Egypt was in the south, and so, or Kemet. And as a consequence, that was a world in which people looked up in the direction we here look south. And so what I have is a passage I usually have read from Kemet, and from Antef, and it's in it's right there in the syllabus. So it means on the very first day of class, we get to read a paragraph by an ancient African. And when they read the paragraph, it's a meditation on what a philosopher is. And he talks about a philosopher as a person who is moved by questions that will make him or her not sleep at night, that is wiser than a sage. And I talk with my students about what in the world does it mean to be wiser than a sage? He talks about the person will seek knowledge where he or she lacks it. So clearly there's about humility there. And it's also about a person who's willing to share knowledge when he or she knows it. And the list goes on. But the main thing is, after we discuss it, the students see the date, and we just continue teaching. And so when they bump into someone who says something like, philosophy began in Greece, in Athens, or, among the Ionians in what is today Turkey or other parts of the Greek-speaking world, my students would, without having anybody having to, hang over their shoulder, just say, well, wait a minute. What you call Greek philosophy is 2,500 years old, but I just read something 4,000 years old from Africa. And they talk about philosophy. And they could say the name of the person. In other words, they have a literacy, you see? And so I think as a pedagogical approach, one problem that happens with many people who, when they refer to, we could call it classicism or African classicism. In other words, the idea of the ancient classic forms of knowledge. The problem is they bring it up, but they don't have the students engage the actual writings, the actual people, or the actual debates, you see? And if the students do that, then they can have a relationship to that knowledge and take it with them. A good example is in the writings by Antef. He also brings up in that rich paragraph, he says the person also, the philosopher, acquaints her or himself with the ancient writings. And so I ask my students, we're reading something 4,000 years old, who's talking about writings that are even much older.
Yeah.
And so they would ask, well, what happened to those writings? And we get to talk about that. A lot of people don't know, for instance, how devastating, how catastrophic the emergence of Christianity was in the destruction of ancient knowledge, because all over what became known as Christendom, libraries, temples, a lot of the reservoirs of knowledge of the ancient world were systematically destroyed. And you know, it's very important for students to understand that it's not that these things disappear overnight. People actively do that, just as today there are people actively trying to destroy even a coherent understanding of what happened in this country. You know, most of the textbooks that high school and middle school and elementary schools students read, come through testing grounds in Texas. Mm-hmm. And Texas, as we know, is trying to erase the fact that this country had enslavement and genocide of the indigenous peoples. And it's being done in the name of a lot of Christian fundamentalism in a similar way that this happened in the ancient world. So just to conclude with the question you asked me, the main thing is to make sure that the students have direct experience and moments of critical reflection with actual material.
And really what you're talking about, the textbooks, really resonates with me, because I really got a lot of my knowledge and history from hip-hop music when I was in high school. I was listening to Dead Prez, and they were talking about Nat Turner. And I asked my teacher, and my teacher didn't even know who Nat Turner was in high school, and the textbooks didn't mention him.
Wow.
And that's what really led me into finding history more on my own, was from hip-hop. And something that really resonates with your work is your emphasis on slave rebellions. And it wasn't that Lincoln woke up one morning and magically wanted to get rid of slavery. You know, it's his legacy of rebellions and resistance and building outside of that structure that people did.
That's correct. And what a lot of young people don't know today, in fact, not even young people, just a lot of people, is Lincoln didn't free any slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation was just basically a statement to affirm that in certain states there wasn't any slavery, and I mean there wasn't the legalization. There was forced servitude, but it was being abolished in many of those areas. But crucially enough, the country was in a civil war. So the proclamation only really was a statement that was made over the Union. But for the Confederate didn't care. So in effect, in other words, it would be only binding if he had authority over the Confederate. But that could only emerge post-Civil War. And post-Civil War, it still wasn't the Emancipation Proclamation, it was the 13th Amendment. And, you know, and even there, all the 13th Amendment did was to render formalized slavery illegal, except, as many of us know, in the case of prisoners, which is one of the reasons why there was a systematic effort to basically create a form of forced servitude through the prison system. And in fact, there wasn't a prison system of the form that we know today. That was produced in an effort of re-enslavement. So, yeah, if the critical skills are there, you know, the students or your story is an excellent example. You'll come across something and say, hey, how come I didn't know this before, and follow a paper trail or a thought experiment and develop a critical relationship to the past to say, wait a minute, not only didn't he not do it, but then you may find your way to Du Bois, who pointed out that what really made the difference around the American Civil War was the enslaved people who came in droves and fought against the Confederate. And so I always remind people, nobody gave black people freedom in the United States. Black people fought for it and are still fighting for it.
Yeah. I'd like to to switch to talking about white supremacy in European philosophy and how these tied into Christendom, colonialism, and capitalism. And, for example, when you're looking at European philosophy and its relationship with global white supremacy, you saw John Locke was invested in the Royal African Company and wrote much of the South Carolina's Constitution justifying slavery. Montague deemed Islam despotic. Voltaire blamed the slave trade on Africans. Kant's anthropology lectures were filled with racist vitriol and supporting racial hierarchy, and Hegel even argued that the flora and fauna of the Americas, which indigenous Americas, were inferior to Europe's. You talk about how these were embedded into this narrative that erased, as you mentioned, like Antef and prior philosophies.
Well, by the time a lot of the philosophers pop up, a lot of things are already in full steam. I usually make a distinction between rationalization and justification. And a lot of these philosophers were articulating rationalizations. And in other words, they were trying to offer reasons for what they're doing anyway, but it doesn't follow that the reasons they were offering were met proper conditions of justification. And so there are many things people could rationalize, or to put it in just plain language, make excuses for, but it doesn't mean they're right. The complicated thing is this: the ancient world. First, we start with the ancient world. The ancient world is very different. The ancient world, not only because it was ancient, but because there were many ways in which there were certain concepts that just didn't really make sense for everyday people. But with the rise of Christianity, a notion of purity began to emerge, and a notion that somehow there should only be one way of living in the world, which is why there were many people forced violently into Christianity, or in some cases, many of their forms of knowledge, libraries, temples, etc., were destroyed. Now, what shifted this was the emergence of Islam. And when Islam emerged as a counterpoint to what was going on with Christianity, Islam also initially spread, but through conquest. And Islam made its way all the way to southern France. And so there was a face-off between Christendom and the caliphates. Now, within Christianity, there was this notion that the foreigners, as they considered them, which by this point were Afro-Muslims, because the caliphates that reached to southern France reached there in under 100 years, and there's no way there were that many Arabs in the world. And so these were people who were Africans who were converted into following Islam. This period was a period of 800-year rule in a domination of the Mediterranean and southern and Iberia by these Afro-Muslim populations. Within them were also Jewish populations, and a lot of people don't realize were also Afro-Jewish populations, and Christians. Now, within that conflict, there are two important shifts, because I know we have a limited time, so I'll just get to them. The first important shift was moving from the Mediterranean as the source of commerce to the Atlantic Ocean. And that movement from the Mediterranean to the Atlantic had within it still this ongoing conflict between Christianity and Islam. And one of the concepts in Christianity that emerged in Iberian Christianity was the notion of, it's really pronounced reza, but in today's accents people say raza. And reza simply meant breeds of dogs, horses, but it included, when applied to human beings, Jews and Moors. And so the race concept really, and this is by the 10th century, preceded those kinds of philosophical reflections. And in the Italian world, it became razzia, and eventually it became the concept of race. Now, the thing about what happened in the Atlantic that shifted things is you have this concept of race, and you had this concept of fighting against the Afro-Muslim populations. And a crucial point was in 1492, where this commerce in the Atlantic began. Because in January 1492, Isabel and Ferdinand defeated the Moors in Grenada. They called it the Reconquest because they wanted to erase the history that the Moors dominated them. And then they had a new stage of Inquisition in which they were searching for the idea of pure blood. In other words, they had what I call a theonaturalism, which is the idea that theologically, that what you were in religious terms was in your blood. And then by October of that year was when Columbus landed in the Bahamas and the whole thing kicked off. Now, at first, you have this notion of purity, and this notion of reconquest. But then what was added to it is the rising accumulation of profit. It's what in Marxism, Marxist analysis of capitalism is called primitive accumulation. But the short version of it is there was suddenly this idea that one can profit as much as one can off of people who are outside of the framework properly of Christendom. But the problem was Christendom was being placed in, Christian identity was being placed in the body. And eventually, in Christianity, there was a schism, as you know, because Protestantism and other forms emerged. But what was different about Protestantism from Catholicism was that Protestantism had this idea that it was somehow deep inside your soul that you can cleanse it in some way through a unique individual relationship to salvation or to God. And this led to a search for this rationalization of purity. And this rationalization of purity began to take the form that if one is properly clean, so to speak, and the language I use in my writings, I refer to it as a form of theodicy. If that is properly, and theodicy is where you try to account for evil when God is supposed to control everything, and the answer is usually that the evil is outside of God, which is very strange to begin with as an argument. But nevertheless, it became the case that if you were to be properly good, pure, then the evil must be outside of you. And the markers of evil increasingly became racial and, interestingly enough, poverty, which is already turning Christianity upside down because, the message of the Gospels was Jesus was on the side of the poor. Mm-hmm. But under capitalism, the mark of your being evil was that you were poor. And so if you were enslaved, you were poor, it became increasingly a notion that there was something wrong with you. And then to make matters worse, if you were wealthy or you were dominant and you were good, then increasingly capitalism became the mark of good. Now, with that, I have to add that when many people talk about capitalism, they don't really understand the history of capitalism, and they don't realize that markets and capitalism are not the same thing. Markets have been around for more than 100,000 years, but capitalism is a perversion of markets into the notion of the market. In other words, one and only market, okay? And it's similar to what you have in monotheism. It's a form of abstraction that says that something that's pure and powerful will dominate. And so a form of idolatry emerged in which capitalism and God and freedom and all of these things were mashed up into one. And so the idea is, if capitalism is ultimately holy, sacred, and good, then nothing should be outside of the reach of capitalism, which means that capitalism should be able to commodify, which means turn into exchange value anything, including people. And so once that emerged, the idea of not only the rationalization of enslavement took a new form, because it's not that they weren't slaves in the past, but this new form of enslavement basically argued that they were people who, by virtue of who and what they were properly to be enslaved. And this now began to meld with the racial concept for slavery. The racial concept, and within it, then now you have the philosophers coming in, because they're now trying to explain and rationalize all of this stuff. Mm-hmm. The thing at the same time is there were also philosophers who were arguing that this was all BS, and among them were black philosophers. Among them were philosophers and among the Europeans, there were those who argued this was nonsense as well. Among them was, for instance, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Thomas Paine. But among the African philosophers and black philosophers were Ottobah Kugano. There were people like Wilhelm Amo. There were elements you could find in the ideas from people like Benjamin Banneker. There was a fellow by the name of Lemuel Haynes, who was in New England, actually was born in the town I live in, West Hartford, Connecticut. Oh. And there is, the list goes on. There was among the African thinkers in the Americas who were founding new forms of religious practices and ideas that led to the AME churches. And the list goes on, and then you'll find it among black women writers in the 19th century, people like Anna Julia Cooper. But the main thing that connects to your point is, yes, there was a whole rationalization of an edifice of exploitation and an effort to create what I call a philosophical anthropology. And a philosophical anthropology basically is about trying to claim that there was the really human, and at this point, they made the notion of purity, absolute power in what they considered to be the real human to be white. And then there's the notion of that the farthest away from white and purity you were, the more problematic, evil, or whatever you want to use the language you were. And it was now thus supposedly justified to exploit your labor and ultimately with the goal of your ultimate erasure from history.
In Kouamno, he was actually challenging David Hume,
correct?
Right, as you wrote about slavery.
He was, and he was more explicit around the Theodicy, which is what I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. But Theodicy itself is worth a long conversation. But the short version, because a lot of thought is dominated by Theodicy. The short version of it is anybody who has been around people with God talk have had a conversation in Theodicy. The short version of it is, if God is all powerful and God is all good, why is there evil? Because God, being all powerful, all knowing, and all good, should do something about evil. Because we, with our limited knowledge, are asked to do something about evil. And so there, in logical terms, there are only two conclusions. One is, well, maybe God isn't good, which not many people would accept as an answer. Or two, there isn't any God. And so to defend the idea that there could be God, and God is good, there are two classic responses. They go all the way back to ancient times. St. Augustine wrote about this, but Gottfried Leibniz wrote about it. And the thing about it is it continues to this day. And the two responses are, the first is, we are finite, God is infinite, so we're judging on the basis of finite knowledge. And so, we're ultimately wrong. God will work it out. And the second one is that God actually, through love, gave us freedom and we screwed it up. So it's not that God couldn't see this, it's just that God loves us so much that God respects our freedom. Now, the important thing with those two arguments is they take the onus off of God and place the blame on people, which, it's perfectly fine if there's no God, it's going to be on people anyway. However, what happened is that once we begin to idolize or fetishize systems, societies, economic systems like capitalism, societies like, say, the United States of America or, good old England or whatever, or certain kinds of knowledge, for instance, natural science, when we treat them like a god, and when we encounter their contradictions, theodicy comes in when we use the same argument. And Du Bois noticed this when he looked at the way the United States talked about what they call the Negro problem. Because the argument is, if black people are poor and black people are going through all kinds of misery, why is that? And the truthful answer is, well, it's because American society is just screwing the black people over in every direction. However, if you're going to say American society is intrinsically good, that the Constitution is perfect, that the founders are perfect, that everything is perfect, then the only way these things could be happening is if the imperfection is in black people, not in what is done to them. And so it's the same kind of argument. And so the problem becomes not what the society is doing, the problem becomes black people themselves. And that's a dangerous argument, but it's an argument that is continued. It's the same argument that's being used right now by the fascists and the alt-right and Trump administration, all of that. It's the same argument that, the problems in the world, it's not through the exploitation of the people and setting up systems designed to produce, in some cases even produce the forms of illness that people will have to respond to to alleviate their misery in certain ways through a rigged economic system. The arguments become there's something wrong with these people. They're predisposed to crime, they're predisposed to disease, they're too stupid to learn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, despite all the historical evidence otherwise. But that's more crass in terms of the political sphere, but it happens in more subtle ways in the scientific sphere. So in the scientific sphere, there are people who would try to naturalize stuff like race, et cetera, and argue that there's somehow something in the actual biology, the flesh and the blood of white people to make them succeed, and there's something intrinsic to the blood or the skin or the brains of black people that make them ill-equipped for development, etc. But it's the same argument. What they erase in these arguments are certain crucial elements. And for the listeners, here's a very simple one, a very straightforward one. If you look all around the world today, you notice structural white wealth. There are poor white people in the world, and they're pissed off because most white people in the world are just not poor people. And so the question is, why? But of course, the number of poor white people is growing because the exploitation is taken on another level. But if we just look at the basic thing, just right around us, it seems like there's something special around white people to create structural white wealth. What many white people don't know today, and many black people, many brown people, is that if prior to the 19th century, there wasn't any structural, in fact, prior to the 20th century, there wasn't any structural white wealth. There was exploitation in many directions, and a lot of things were going quite amok, but eventually certain policies were developed, and a lot of these policies were connected to the arguments from some of the philosophers you mentioned, but they were also connected to certain politicians and certain academics outside of philosophy and in other areas of the academy, sociology, economics, etc. And they began to create recommendations for what they call global race relations. And today, it's embarrassing, but for many in the area of international relations today. But there's a man by the name of Bob Vitalis who wrote a book on this. Basically, today, what we know as foreign relations and international relations used to be called very blatantly what it was: race, so-called race relations. And the idea was that the white race should dominate the world, but for the white race to dominate the world, one has to create the conditions that distributed wealth exclusively among whites. You see? Mm-hmm. But the problem was to do this wouldn't work if you stuck to blatant capitalism. And so what happened was amendations or corrections were being made to blatant capitalism to, in effect, create social welfare mechanisms for whites. And if you look in the history of this country as an example, almost every period of social welfare corrections to capitalism were developed with, in writing, the lack of accessibility to those benefits by people of color. So blacks particularly were excluded from so many things, from Social Security all the way, early versions of Social Security all the way to resources through which to go to college, to university, special loans through which to acquire property, etc. This is just standard history. Mm-hmm. But the main point is, if you look at not only the United States, but countries like South Africa, what a white South African had access to was low-cost education, infrastructures ranging from healthcare to clean water to you just go down the list. And these investments produced white structural wealth. In other words, to make sure if you go through most of the world, the worst off people you will meet, it's very unlikely that they will be white. And what I often explain to students is this is proof, not simply of the history of structural racism, but it's also proof that forms of socialism work. In other words, social welfare states produced structural white wealth. That's what produced Scandinavia. That's what produced Denmark. That's what helped actually the United Kingdom. That's what worked in France, and it's what worked in the United States. In other words, the structural affluence of white America is a function of the social welfare state, because the richest whites don't want to share their stuff with anybody. But there was a sufficient pressure put on them to share it with a sufficient number of other whites to create that wealth. And so once we begin to see this, the problem is, so you could see the obvious point. So there was nothing inside of white people biologically or cognitively that made white people well off. It was social and political policies that were designed for the production of that wealth that created it. And so that means the Theodicy argument that white people are intrinsically better fails. And in fact, and then you have to add to it, there are many instances throughout history, and this is something that, for instance, a very famous European German physicist who became anthropologist, Franz Boas, has pointed out that, white domination, white wealth has only been around not even 200 years. Our species is nearly 220,000 years old. That means for a good portion of the history of our species, prosperity, innovation, technological transformation, you name it, and including wealth, was predominantly, basically, African or African and Asian. And so whites are very recent on the scene. Europe, in that capacity, is very recent. And so that fact already undermines that Theodician kind of argument. But the Theodician argument is seductive because people are already schooled in it just by virtue of the religious backgrounds they're from. They're used to arguments that say God has blessed you to be better than other people.
Well, thank you. I want to switch now to Fanon a little bit, and your discussions about love. I really like your writings about love. It's very romantic at times, Dr. Gordon. You say love says that a person should exist and that the world would not be the same without her, him, or they.
And love is about commitment, generational commitment to pave a path for change for future generations that one won't necessarily see the benefits for now. And there's a quote by Fanon, I feel, that exemplifies this. He says, "As a man, I have undertaken facing the risk of annihilation for the sake of shedding light on 2 to 3 truths about the world." And I was wondering if you could kind of speak about Fanon and love and this type of commitment.
Sure. I mean, I think the quotes you just used captured it beautifully. Because we have limited time, I'm just going to give a very short version. The short version is a lot of what we've been talking about so far, including racism, is premised upon a lie that dominates a lot of the thinking, our thinking about love. And the lie is that we can only love ourselves. And because of that, we premise love on similitude. And so it's like when somebody says, I love you because you're like me. It's narcissistic love, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you look at a lot of even the argument that says people can only like their own kind, they must be, that's that kind of love. The problem with it is that if you radicalize it, it's not only that you can only love yourself, but the moment you don't act like yourself, you need to hate yourself. So love could only be possible then if it's possible to love what is not like yourself, to love something other than yourself. The most radical example of this is God, because, in Judaism, you're not supposed to have any image of God, because ultimately God is supposed to transcend you. So God is supposed to be the radical loving of something other than you. But what we know at a very basic level is that a lot of us, a woman can love a man can love a woman, and even with same-sex love, the idea is not the sameness. Your partner could be somebody from a background very different. We know people could love animals. Okay, we know people. There are so many forms of love that are out there. And the basic point is this. The basic point is that that when love occurs, the other is not treated as a closed relationship. The other is open to you, which means the other is always possibility. And this possibility is such that it can be extended. And so if we look at these possibilities, one example of this is that when we do political action, it is impossible for us to be everywhere and to see everything, which means every political act eventually is an act of having a relationship to someone who's anonymous. Mm-hmm. And this anonymity is the form of difference, because if once the person is that anonymous, the person's just not like you. You don't know who it is. And this is the insight that Fanon had and many others, that true political practice, the moment it's about the future, is ultimately a commitment, a gift of love to the anonymous. And this is the distinction, I argue in my writings, also between the right and the left. Because you see, the right tends to respond to issues of crisis by trying to return to what they imagine was a perfect past. That's why you have this nonsense like "Make America Great Again," But they cherry pick the past. And what they can do in the past is, because they could point to things that are not anonymous, and they could reassert a narcissistic love based on the self, and that's why right-wing and conservative models almost always collapse into xenophobia and racism, etc. Because once it's about being like you, then you have to erase all that is different. However, what the left-wing oriented model tends to say, and this is where Fanon is located, is that if you go and look in the past, what people were doing in the past was trying to make things better, which means the past was never perfect to begin with. This means the response to the crisis of today is not to go back, it's to try to figure out how to go forward. But the thing about going forward is nobody lives forever. So that means going forward is going to affect people whom you'll never know. And so if you're going to take the responsibility for that, for it not to become violence or abuse, there has to be a love that's involved in being able to set the conditions for those others to look back at you and actually say, thank God you acted. In other words, to say the way, and in my writings I bring up Frederick Douglass, so this is an example. Frederick Douglass appreciated the action of his mother when she basically visited him for 6 months before she died. And this enslaved woman, because he was 7 years old, had no way to know what the future would be for that child. Mm-hmm. For all she knew, he had just been a slave who was beaten to death, and that was it. And so all acts of love premised upon difference, commitment, and an act of building a future, all of them have the risk of uncertainty. And so what I've argued, and Fanon has a similar view, is that political action is not about knowing the outcome. Political action is about commitment to an action that needs to be done. And through an understanding that the outcome isn't for you, it really is for those who transcend you.
And as you say, with people trying to look back to the past, that we now have a global leadership that has no commitment to descendants and ancestors.
They don't. And I see that this is one of the most dangerous elements of the contemporary situation, because generations before had this idea that it was good to become an ancestor. And so through respecting, one of the unusual things about human beings is we actually honor or respect what was done by the dead. Now, even though the dead are dead, why do we do this? Mm-hmm. And implicit in it is because we have an understanding of descendants. And it's not descendants in the sense of saying, oh, look what I have created. It's the idea that we're custodians of a world that is beyond us. And so the thing about, if we look at ourselves today as ancestors of the future, then that means that there are things for us to do. Unfortunately, and this is something that's connected with capitalism, because capitalism also attempts to conquer time. It erases the fidelity to the ancestors, and it also, because it's all about the radicalized individual, avaricious, selfish self, it erases commitment to the future. And so that means, under that model, to put it bluntly, F the descendants, and who cares about the ancestors? It's all about me. And so we're in a dangerous period, because we're in a period of being governed by people who have no commitment actually to the future. And for them, they're fighting to get theirs now. And because they, unfortunately, they hate the fact, but they know they're going to die one day. But for them, when they die, that is the end of the world, because their narcissism makes them solipsistic. Their narcissism makes them the world.
This question was about your research and thought, if there are any intersections you have with anarchism. And I know you've discussed Fanon's disagreements with Engels, who wasn't an anarchist, but he did speak about abolishing the state. And in Fanon's case, he wanted to explore a non-colonial state. He called it a renaissance of the state, or a federalism. And you've also spoke about building power outside of state structures to make the state eventually obsolete, in a way similar to a Zapatista model in your work with Jane Anna Gordon, not only the master's tools.
Well, okay. So I apologize to the listeners that this would be a very brief answer. The first part is, I think a lot of anarchism is caricatured. And it's very difficult when we talk about anarchism, because I'm in a continuous study of anarchism, mainly because the first thing that that should make us think about at least the writings of anarchists is that these are some of the most brilliant writers in history. So it clearly weren't stupid people, in the sense that they were pulling things out of their butt, Second is we're talking about writings of some of the most courageous people in history, whether they're Lucy Parsons, whether they're He Jian in China. It's interesting, too, when I go through my studies of anarchism, how many women I come across, women intellectuals in the history of anarchism. Third, the complexity of anarchism is that I begin to realize in the United States particularly, we confuse anarchism with libertarianism.
Yeah, very dangerous.
Libertarianism is very different from anarchism. And again, I apologize for being very brief, but the distinction is the distinction between liberty and freedom. And liberty just means the absence of a constraint. But freedom is something more than that. Freedom is the conditions that enable you to act with responsibility and able to build community with others. And there's something very different between freedom, and this explains why, for instance, so many women writers are interested in it. And whereas you could find a lot of male writers tend to like the notion of libertarianism, because there's an imagined notion of walking around like a god, all powerful by yourself in the wilderness and get whatever you want. However, human beings can't live that way. Human beings, we're born very vulnerable, and we need communities to survive and grow up in. And so the first mistake about anarchism is to think that anarchism is about getting rid of, a world of others, etc. So there's a very thick social theory of anarchism to bear in mind. The other thing is many anarchists tend to be radical believe in radical democracy, and by that what I mean is they tend to argue that if the social mechanisms of living and working together are sufficiently thick, then people can take responsibility for their future, etc. Now, however, there's a divide among many anarchists because many anarchists see states as top-down structures. And they look at states the way I analyze capitalism, which is a form of institutional abstraction that dominates you and controls you and blocks the capacity for creativity and freedom. Now, the thing is that Fanon and people like myself, we're always critical of what happens when we treat human institutions as non-human. And so for us, the state is not a floating abstraction over people. The state is actually something created by people. And because states are created by people, it is up to people what forms they take. And so as human institutions, the big issue is the extent to which they're malleable and adaptable to the needs of different historical periods, times, and material conditions. So if we put it together, the short version then is that the problem with being an intrinsic anti-statist is that one ontologizes or make in an abstract way the independent power of the notion of a state. Whereas if one recognizes that states are human institutions, then one has the question of what is a proper political relationship to a state. And this is something not just Fanon, but Jean-Jacques Rousseau thought about as well. He made a distinction between governance and politics. And he saw legitimacy and the actual will, so to speak, of people more as political, whereas interests of people tend to be in governing institutions. And so one of the things that Fanon, and again, people like myself are concerned with, is what properly are political relationships. And we argue that political relationships make no sense without power, but power has to be understood as simply the ability to make things happen. The same abstraction that was done to states was done to power, And many people began to treat power as something that they should eliminate. But the problem with that is that human beings wouldn't even be on this planet today if we didn't have power. In other words, we need to understand power is what enabled us to get up in the morning, and the complex set of mechanisms that led to you and me being able to speak on the phone right now. Mm-hmm. And so the real issue, we argue, is not power, but is how power is used. Power could be used, one could use one's ability to make things happen to block other people from their ability to make things happen. And that is called disempowerment. So racism, colonialism, and exploitation, all of those things, sexism, the whole stratification of people, that's disempowerment. And that's the abusive use of power. If we're going to respond to the abusive use of power, the only way to respond to disempowerment is to empower people. Mm-hmm. And so the Fanonian argument, and my argument, and many others, and I would argue that it's there in Lucy Parsons and people like Krike and Jen, is that the argument is that people, human power, people power, is not like God power. God's power, God can do whatever God wants, and it just is. But human power emerges through the unique ability we have to produce culture, social systems, institutions, etc. And so, so empowering is actually finding ways to connect people to create communities for the continued empowering of others. And so I argue that political action is about increasing the options by which people can actually be empowered.
Mm-hmm. Man, that's a beautiful answer. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you.
You have blown my mind on a Friday morning, so thank you.
Well, thank you for the kind invitation to participate in the podcast.
Monday morning, gotta get out of bed. Had a dream that messed up my head. It's gonna be a classic day. Dull and boring in every way. There's a girl who I like. Wonder if she will ever look my way. My friends are gone away. Just my teenage anxiety. Wondering if people see me as a boy. Wonder if the girl I like will look my way. Wonder if I ever succeed in life. Just my teenage anxiety tonight. Why do all the girls like the classic douche? A guy who's destined to fail with his sports career and life on the line. A good-looking person stops the road as I make it speed up. Sorry for my negativity, just my teenage anxiety. Wonder if people see me as a boy. Wonder if the girl I like will look my way. Wonder if I ever succeed in life. Just my teenage anxiety tonight. I'm finally gone from this place. No more goddamn fuckery. I'm just gonna take a break and play now, sleep all day. High school really sucked for me, as it probably sucked for you. So I'm sure you can relate with my teenage
That was the song Teenage Anxiety from Lewis Gordon's band ThreeGenerations. He's the drummer, and his son Elijah's the lead singer. Pick up their album called Now. Thank you for listening once again. Please share and spread the word. The podcast really has been growing. I appreciate everyone. And thanks to Awareness for the music.